Oh, you don't know?
After 12, so good afternoon. My name is Sarah Ripp. I'm the Outreach Coordinator and Undergrad Advisor for the Latin American Caribbean and Hungarian Studies program here at UW. We're very pleased to have you today. Just wanted to make a couple quick announcements. Over in the corner there on the table is a sign-in sheet for our listserv if you're interested in receiving our email updates once a week for other events that we have if you're not already on the list. There's some information about our academic programs, and then the yellow handout is the rest of the lecture series for the remainder of the semester. The last two, we don't have information on yet, but the rest there's a lot of detailed info about, so hopefully you can join us for a few more of our talks. And I'll turn it over to Severina Albuquerque. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm the director of the Brazil Initiative, and one of the things that we do, in addition to lectures like this one, in combination with Latin American Studies, is this award that we give. This is actually already the third event of the Brazil Initiative this semester. So we give this award annually, Joaquim Nabuco Award. In the interest of time, I will just direct you to the website of the initiative, which is brazil.wis.edu, and there you can click on Joaquim Nabuco Award, and if you have the time, learn more about the initiative. But it is essentially an award for one undergrad and one grad student every year at UW for the best paper written on Brazil, any field that academic year. The donor, the very generous donor, has allowed us to continue for 5 more years. So we are safe until 2017, I think. So take a look at it. It is the price has increased now for both for undergrad and grad. And so I will now give the floor to Professor Christine Ewig, who is an associate professor of political science and gender and women's studies here at the UW. She is a member of Nick's dissertation committee and has advised him from the beginning with this project that he is going to be presenting on. We're grateful to Professor Ewig for being introduced Nick this afternoon.
Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Christina. I am really pleased to introduce Nicholas Barnes today, who is the winner, as you heard, of the Nabuco Award for graduate paper submission on Brazil. I'm going to give you just a little bit of background on Nick before he talks to you about this paper that he'll be presenting today. So Nick came to us with an undergraduate degree in Spanish, along with a few other degrees in his undergraduate years. Went on to study peace and conflict, nationalism, both at University College in Dublin and then at the University of Haifa in Israel. So he had this interest in peace and conflict studies before applying to our program at UW. But when he came to UW, when he came to political science, in his application he said he wanted to focus on Latin America. So pretty soon after he came and talked with me, and I got to know him a little bit. And I would say within that first year, it wasn't Latin America, it was Brazil that he decided to focus on. And I've been impressed watching Nick as he has thrown himself into really understanding Brazilian language, Brazilian culture. He was beneficiary of one of our summer class fellowships, came back with the Distinguished Student Award for learning Portuguese that summer, continued without special funding and class funding to study Portuguese through his graduate years here while TAing, and those of you who have been graduate students know how much work that is to manage language studies, TAing, and the normal course load in your discipline. He was a beneficiary of some of our summer funding to do preliminary dissertation research in Brazil, and he's come back with friends, with colleagues, with a really strong network in Brazil. And of course, he dedicated some of his coursework, some of his research and his coursework to Brazil, and that is where this paper comes from. It began as a seminar paper, and he continued work on it and refine it. And I would believe I think, a very interesting contribution, a new way of looking at the landless movement in Brazil in a way that certainly I had never contemplated thinking about it. And so I think you'll enjoy this presentation. But let me tell you a little bit about where Nick is going. So within about a month, he's going to be off to Brazil for the year. He has funding from the SSRC Democracy, Security, Drugs, Democracy, and Security Fellowship to conduct his dissertation work. This dissertation work is going to go a little bit different direction, not in the landless movement. Actually, a pretty strongly different direction, but still in Brazil. But I think it nicely combines his background that he came to UW with on peace and conflict studies with his interest in Latin America and Brazil. And he's going to be looking at gang governance, and specifically the use of violence in gang governance in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. So I expect that to be an important dissertation, especially given what we know about the growing effects of gang violence across the region, not just in favelas like Brazil. So let Nick tell us about this research.
Thank you very much. You know, it's funny hearing your personal history told back to you, that like all the decisions you make don't seem to make that much sense when you're making them. It's just sort of dumb luck and happenstance that you come to study the things that you do, I find, more often than not. But we'll accept that version of it. Yeah, so maybe a little bit about this project in particular. I had come to UW-Madison in political science through identity work and nationalism and peace and conflict studies. And then I continued to go down that line in a social identities coursework or seminar with one of the faculty members in political science. But by this time I had started to study Latin America and Brazil. So, and the landless movement really interested me. Rural violence and conflict over land specifically interested in me for a while. So but I wanted to look at a specific identity group. And the more I read about the MST, the more, especially their history, the more I sort of realized that there are these religious aspects, religious identification processes that they use within the organization that I think are more important than maybe the literature leads on. So that's where this began. And then I spent 10 dark and cold days in one of the libraries looking over microfilm from one of their journals where I got the bulk of the data from. So that's sort of the beginning. Even though this project, I've moved on to other projects, I'm still interested in this and hope to continue to work on this paper and maybe submit it to a journal. So maybe first a little bit about the Brazilian historical context for those who aren't aware how the MST first formed. One, in Brazil, there's massive land inequality, one of the most unequal countries when it comes to land distribution. About 1% of the population owns 47 or about half of all land. The top 10% owns about 85% of all land. And this is a legacy really of colonialism, and there was no real land redistribution after independence in the subsequent 200 years, even through democracy, right? Or democratization. And the second is at least in the formative period of the MST, is you have military dictatorship from 1964 to 1985. During this period, there's little opportunity for the marginalized, the rural poor to really organize. And in addition, during this era, you have the industrialization of the agricultural sector. So instead of redistributing land to individual farmers, they're making conglomerations and corporations to try to grow as much food for as cheap as possible. So with these other two elements, you have the confluence of the third, and that is this liberation theology in the Catholic Church. So after the Vatican II Council, the Roman Catholic Church made some more progressive reforms to the institution, such as masses were now held in vernacular instead of Latin. They desacralized the clergy. And so with this sort of progressive move, a lot of clergy within Latin America especially came to subscribe to this liberation theology, which sort of holds that, essentially it's the reinterpretation of the teachings of Jesus Christ through the eyes of the poor, right? And so they look to advocate for these previously marginalized or historically marginalized populations, and they really want to change the Catholic Church from a very hierarchical institution into a community-based, decentralized one. So they organize these ecclesiastical-based communities throughout many communities, especially in Brazil. And again, liberation theology is not something just reserved for Brazil. It happens throughout Latin America. Brazil is one of the countries where the movement is especially strong. So these ecclesiastical-based communities are where communities can come together outside of the specific influence of the church and talk about spirituality, religion, social reform, these sorts of things. So it allows these groups in the rural areas especially to engage in organization, right? Really, that's not really allowed under the military dictatorship. But because it's through the Catholic Church, they have more space to do this. So it's formally founded in 1984. Today it represents 1.5 million members, 350,000 families, and over 2,000 settlements in every state of Brazil. The settlements are squatter settlements. So the way that the MST gains rights to land is on unused land, they'll invade the property and just squat on it until they can gain the rights through the courts. Now, this is not always a peaceful process. Landowners don't particularly like it when a group just sits on their land that's theirs. So they've sent militias, vigilantes, assassins to kill and to remove these people in certain cases. And there's actually quite a lot of violence that still goes on in some of these places. So, and it's in every state in Brazil. The MST has connected itself to powerful political parties. It had an especially close connection to the Workers' Party, the PT, for a long time. Now that the PT is in power, they have, and has sort of moved more towards the center, they have more disagreements with the PT. But nonetheless, there are still connections that remain. They have chapters in other Latin American countries, such as Bolivia, and they've linked themselves to other sort of international reform movements, such as Via Campesina. So an incredibly strong social movement. So regarding these linkages to the Catholic Church in the formation, what's interesting is at the inception, when they founded the organization, they severed all formal ties with the Catholic Church. So the clergy that were supporting and sort of organizing the MST had to make difficult decisions whether or not they were going to sever their own ties with the Catholic Church or stay in the church itself. And many of them did end up severing ties and joining the MST. So the absolute loyalty was demanded from the leadership. Some of the church, okay, so now over time, the Catholic Church has become more conservative in Brazil. Many of the progressive clergy members were replaced with more conservative ones. And so over time, these two, the social movement and the Catholic Church, there's a lot of distance between them now. And a lot of this comes from disagreement over policies on women and children. The movement believes that women and children are essential to the movement itself and should be leaders, and they have a different vision of maybe a family life than the Catholic Church does. And in addition, the group is not shy about conflict with landowners and the government. They're very willing to engage them, not necessarily violently, but they're very willing to criticize them, whereas the Catholic Church wants a more no-conflict, peaceful sort of move towards land reform. Not always possible. So, the Mística. This is a sort of rather amorphous term for what is essentially the basic rituals and liturgy of the movement. Mística can refer to symbols, myths, objects, performances, so they can use the term to refer to dance or theater, hymns, songs, and then actual objects as well. So the cross is a Mística. Farm tools, when they use it in these rituals or these religious practices, are considered Mística. The symbol, the flag, hats that they wear. So it's not a real specific term for any of these things, but all of the terms refer to this ritualistic, spiritual aspect of the organization whenever they're using it. The Mística borrow from a diverse array of cultural sources that include Catholicism, obviously, but also indigenous and slave cultures, millenarianism, and socialist doctrine. So they've sort of borrowed a lot of symbols and myths from a lot of these different roots and sort of combined them into the Mística. In addition, so there's time set aside each day in the settlements themselves, and they have congresses and assemblies that they have as well, and there will be time set aside for Mística then as well. And it can last, these sorts of performances or readings or songs or processions can last anywhere from 15 minutes to several hours if it's a particular day that has a lot of historical significance. And here I've included some pictures of some of the Mística. This is either right before or after one of the performances, and the woman is carrying a cross. And we can see in the procession people are singing, and they're carrying farm tools, a hoe, a sickle, more crosses. In the background, you see them all sort of sitting off to the side waiting for the ritual to either begin or it just ended. So we have hoes, sickles, crosses. Here's the flag. And you see the woman standing in front of the man, which I mentioned the disagreement over the role of women in the organization. So you can sort of see it emblematic there. Okay, so the actual paper that I wrote had a couple of different objectives, and then a couple of different questions within each of those objectives. So first, I argue that the MST has cultivated this sort of religious identity through the Mística, whereas the literature really assumes that the MST is just a class-based, sort of secular-oriented organization or social movement. Now, within that, I have a couple of questions that really interested me. And that was, what functions do the Mística actually serve for the MST? We can see what's going on, but I wanted to investigate it further. And has the use of Mística changed over time? So you might think because they've separated themselves from their real religious roots in the church, that the use of Mística might decrease over time. They've become more, class-based in essence. And you might think that the Mística have reduced in their importance for the organization. Or there's also a lot of competition with evangelical Protestants and the Pentecostal church over members, over adherents, because they largely draw their members from the same communities. And those are the poor, the uneducated, indigenous, Afro-descendants, right? So in a very real sense, they're competing for the same two groups, or the same groups of people. So Mística might be the spiritual element within the organization that really is able to draw people in, right? And in the same way that Pentecostal churches or evangelical Protestant churches have this really spiritual community aspect to them as well. So you might think, well, maybe the use of Mística has changed over time because of that. So I just wanted to further investigate those possible hypotheses. Now, within my own discipline, within political science, the literature on religion and politics I find to be sort of overly narrow in how they conceptualize and theorize religion and its impact on politics. And I sort of categorize them into two branches or two approaches. And one is the Weberian, and that is that humans are at their core irrational, and religion is this irrational aspect of human beings. And it drives human beings to certain behaviors through the different types of religious ideas they have. Their belief in heaven and hell, in certain deities. So they're really, in this school, they're really looking at the content of ideas, right, that any religion may have. And so the questions they ask are, what do members believe? And then they look at the impact on politics by how people behave because they believe these things, right? So in the second is the political economic approach to religion. And this approach believes that humans are at their core rational. And so when people become religious, it's because churches or religious organizations offer them things, right? They offer them maybe safety or some sort of resources, right? And so this really focuses on religious leaders and organizations in what they call the religious market, right? Supply and demand, people who want religion, and then the people who are going to provide it. And the questions they ask are, how do churches get adherents? How do churches get members? And what do they give them to get them to be members, right? And they don't really look at the content of the ideas very much. So what I'm proposing is a third sort of approach, and this derives from Durkheim's work. And he says that religion is at its core a social phenomenon. You can't really study it on an individual basis. Religion only exists in communities or groups, right, from their core. And it serves 4 specific functions for these communities or groups. The first is cohesion, right, the creation of strong communal bonds. The second is vitality, the cultivation of energy and spirit for the community. The third is euphoria, the creation of feelings of happiness and effervescence. And then discipline is the last, and that's the administration and enforcement of sort of behavior, right? What people are supposed to be doing and not supposed to be doing. So when he writes that the rites, and I've included the Mística there, are a manner of acting which take rise in the midst of the assembled groups and which are destined to excite, maintain, or recreate mental states in these groups, right? So if you think about that in the context of the other 2 approaches, it's not just the content of ideas or the rational incentives that people have to join the groups, but it's the communal experience itself, right? It's the practices and symbols and mythologies that shape the experience of someone being in the MST that I think is essential to understanding the group. So the methodology. Now, studying the MST is a difficult task because it's massive. It's in every state in Brazil, 1.5 million members, and it's existed for the last 30 years. So I thought that the best way to try to analyze the progress of the group, the use of the Mística, would be through some of their writings, right? Their journals that they've maintained from the beginning of the organization. And their main journal is this Jornal Sem Terra. And it's published monthly since the early 1980s. The readership is large with over 20,000 issues. And they read these out loud in many of the settlements. And it's written by and for members. So it's not only an editorial or journalism staff that writes this, they also accept letters, and they have people from the settlements themselves who submit articles. In addition, it's the major source of ideology and identity content that the organization really puts out. And they've increased, they have other journals now in the last few years in addition to the Jornal Sem Terra. They have one for children, they have one for a variety of different, but I just focused on this one in particular. And this is the cover of one of the months. So I looked at 2 sample periods. One from the early 1990s, where because the Library of Congress unfortunately does not have those from the 1980s, and it's very hard to get your hands on those. So 1990 through 1995, and then ever since the late 1990s, they have all the rest of them available online, which is really awesome. So analyzing the second set was a little bit easier. So I extracted all of the texts that were specifically about Mística. Any reference to Mística, I extracted it. Some full articles are about it, right? So I would take the whole text there. Other texts, they'll be talking about something that was happening in one of the settlements, and they'll reference Mística, or they'll just talk about it for a sentence or a paragraph. I would extract that paragraph or that sentence, right? Because I really wanted to get the local context of what they're talking about when they're talking about Mística, why it's used, and how people think and write about it. So I created a theoretically informed codebook of the 4 functional categories that I listed earlier, and this is in line with other work that's been done using content analysis. This is one such article. So this is one that's specifically about Mística. And so there were several of these. It's not that often that they have the whole article that's about the Mística. Most of the time it's a paragraph or a few sentences, right? But this is one of the ones that was about. This is the code book. I have the 4 functional categories, and then I went through secondary and primary sources and looked at some of the words that I would think would fall into those specific categories. Some of them, if they crossed over multiple categories, I got rid of them, right? You can see there's like little stars, so a lot of the words don't end because it can be in the plural or it can be conjugated in different ways, so it only goes with the root. That's how these quantitative content analysis programs work. So I'd like to discuss for a few minutes the different things that I saw qualitatively as I'm reading through all of these and as I'm reading some of the secondary literature. So cohesion, right? This is one of the functions of the Mística for this group, is that it fosters participation and togetherness, right? It brings the entire community together in one place. Whoops. Uh-oh. Let's go back. Sorry. Oh no. What did I do? I have in there, but maybe I can leave them for the very end. So I was going to talk about the four functions that the Mística serves. So the first is this cohesion, right? And this fosters participation and togetherness in the community. It enables especially the illiterate and the less politically minded to engage in a very productive and serious way with the organization. So there's a huge disparity in the education levels of adherents. Some are very educated, university educated. This idea of social reform and land redistribution is what brings them into the organization. Some, the organization is going to provide them land to have a decent life, right? So there's a variety of incentives for people to get into the organization, and the Mística really allow all of the community to come together.